Hello and welcome to my commentary on your second Google Hangout on Air for Kayla, Nicole, and Kennedy. I wanted to say that overall you provided a very exhaustive discussion on all the questions, and you had a very good flow between the facilitation and participation of all of you, and you worked the camera very well. So whenever one of you were speaking, I was able to see that person. One issue that I did have is with Kennedy's clarity of transmission. I literally missed about 70% of your input, Kennedy, because I could not hear it. And I think at some point in a session, you did have a, you were asking one another, can you hear me? And Nicole said, yeah, you blurred out there. So when you do the Google Hangout free, I really want you to make sure that you do run a test session on whatever your mics are doing, or, whatever it is, because I understand you had some phone ringing and stuff at the beginning, that happens, but I could not hear your answers on the, your conversation that you had. I was just getting bits and pieces of that, so I don't want to lose that opportunity to get the whole gist of it. Okay, so I'm just going to give you the little rundown of the things that you discussed that I liked and enjoyed listening to. So the first one was about the systems perspective and the Homeland Security and emergency management landscape. And, there are very, very many ways to cut this, how we want to look at all those different parts. I think Kayla decided to go and look at the website and start looking at the functions of infrastructure and cybersecurity and disasters and human trafficking. So you looked at the topics that are of interest, or there are core dimensions of the field. And so that was one way of doing it. So a lot of different topics that cut across different disciplines. That's where the systems come in. Different disciplines bring different professionals and so on and so forth. The other way of looking at it would be to look at it from the standpoint of jurisdiction. So going like a national incident management system, right? Going from federal through state, through regional, through local. So that very tiered sort of breakdown of different jurisdictions in the United States. And then once you do that administratively like that, then you can have a second plane. And the second plane that cuts across it is private and public, right? Because in addition to the fact that you have all those different tiered organizations at different levels, they fall generally along, the private and the public sphere. Of course, there's also citizens and all that. If you look at the whole community approach by FEMA and so on, if you see something, say something, there are also actors in that. But we're not looking at them in a way of being, they're not getting paid for those efforts. They're not, they're not part of a system in that sense. So that's also a way of looking at it, at how many layers, vertically and horizontally there are to all those different things. Another way to look at it was to take DHS specifically, the Department of Homeland Security, and just look at how many different agencies with different missions, such as Secret Service, such as FEMA, such as TSA, such as Coast Guard and so on and so forth, Border Patrol, are under DHS specifically, and then look at other departments across the government that are, under the Department of Justice. You've got the FBI and so on and so forth. Under State Department, you've got CIA and all that. And so within the DHS, there are agencies with all those different missions, and then they also have to work across, if you just look at the federal level. So as Kayla said, this is so many moving parts, and that's true. Try to think how you would somebody asked you what Homeland Security is and how it's populated. Think about a model you would draw to show those different parts. And again, have a system of conceptually thinking about it. And I don't care how you think about it, as long as it is some sort of dimensions, private versus public, federal all the way down to local, or just federal across all different agencies, or just within DHS, and then how the DHS itself has to branch out because it is, it's a face of Homeland Security, but certainly it's not all there is to Homeland Security. I think it would be very short-sighted to just look at DHS and say this is Homeland Security. That was, it's a federal agency. That's all it is. But Homeland Security is so much more than that. So, Kennedy, a link to the readings on the systems perspective and ecology, knowing how those different parts operate, or having a general knowledge. And that's why you're studying that topic, right? Because you need to know how that Homeland Security is populated, but what different stakeholders and what different moving parts. And in as much as the same way as a doctor that studies, all different parts of the body, even though, they're going to be a podiatrist, they probably don't need to learn much about gynecology, but, all those systems are connected. And so I really like that you brought the medicine to it, because truly, you've got all those specializations, but a true practitioner, a true good doctor is very holistic. And because the symptoms can be, very similar for a lot of different issues, and it could be just one difference, right? That's going to manifest itself on something totally different. Nicole mentioned about the NASA and how NASA did not stick to the model that the Europeans had, that they were all independent parts, but created this model of interdependency. That's why it was so successful in contrast with its European counterpart. And of course, you talked about what are the necessary components in the system thinking for this HSAM environment to work. And I think that the two things that you teased out, and that might have been Nicole that talked about it, is education and communication. And communication pretty much, permeates your entire discussion. And I think that's, very intuitive, because we do work as societies. We pretty much rooted in speech and communication acts. That's what sort of drives the society, it's communication acts. So the second question was talking about failures, if you can identify, based on the readings about NASA and all that, and the systems, you can identify failures in HSAM that did not take the system perspective into account. And Kennedy mentioned the 9/11, I believe, and certainly the 9/11 Commission report, if you have not read it, specifically the chapter on intelligence failures pre 9/11, certainly the chapter on heroes and horror that I think you did study in Emergency Management 1. Those are certainly the cases where different federal agencies were operating under different clearances, under different budgets, under different classification systems, under different missions, under different goals. And so even though they in themselves had a lot of intelligence, that intelligence was not fused and it was not collected, and it was competitive intelligence, as we discussed in our, if you were in my intelligence class, that was the times of competitive intelligence, right? To get the best at a one time of int that you were doing, so if you're a human, you're doing human, you're the best of it. And then another agency does SIGINT or whatever. And the concept of fused intelligence, so kind of like all hazards and emergency management, was not endorsed, was not supported. It's not necessarily that, anybody made mistakes. It was just the way those organizations were culturally situated at the time. So definitely 9/11 intelligence failures are a good example of that, how the agencies were not a system, were not working in a way that more structured NASA at the time of its greatest success. And the other thing I think you talked about, so you talked about silos, and but I think that Nicole and the team, I think that when we are looking at this, trying to figure out the system, it's not very easy. You know, Kayla throughout the session was saying, I mean, you know, it's as simple as, you know, communication and information sharing, but again, what comes into play is politics. You know, all those different agencies are under different departments. Their budgeting is different. Their security levels or classifications for information are different. And it just makes me think about, you know, National Incident Management System when it first came out, and I started running the integrated training for NIMS. It was very difficult to bring together educators, for example, and police officers, or nurses and police officers. I would bet it still is. It is really very much in the will of the people on the ground. They are trying to break those walls of funding. Because, you know, even if there was a free training, let's say we put the free training for police officers and nurses in public health, and we offered it for a week. You could come to our institute and play and do exercises together. But, you know, a police officer, in order to go for a 1 week training, has to fill out a bunch of protocols, and the training officer has to approve it, and their funding will cover a certain type of training. The nurses, of course, in order to get away from a hospital or something for a week, you know, somebody's got to pay for it. And if they're going to an institute that's for law enforcement, you know, they might not be, their training might not be on their priority list, even though it's free. So there is so much more to communications than just the will. And the information sharing and stuff like that. It sounds really good. And yes, we need to do this, but our policies, our organizational structures, and specifically the funding is allocated in such a way that a lot of times it's constraining and preventing those things to happen. So a lot of times it's very difficult, even though people understand, yes, we need to speak the same language. We need to have a common operating picture. And then you get a grant, and that grant is the police departments. And then another grant is for fire departments. And then another grant is for nurses. And those grants already, that money that's allocated, they already don't meet. So the failures happen at the highest strategic level of figuring out those concepts as well, not necessarily by the people not willing to do this. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, because to understand that it's a multi-layered, very complex environment of different organizations with different purse strings and with different coffers and with different political interdependencies, you know, where there's political stuff. You know, CIA and the FBI certainly did not have the organizational culture of working together since the time of Hoover and Bill Donovan. So those two agencies would never, ever have a very similar mission because of the years and years and years of culture in them. So that exists too, and it's very hard to change. So how did NASA leverage the private component? So you, I think Kayla was talking about the tabletops and the command center and the collective behaviors that transpired in the active shooter preparedness exercise we did. And so you spoke to that. And this is a great example, but you also have to realize that it has taken years to bring those executives from the university with those police officers, with those people from marketing, because emergency preparedness was not really a mission of those administrators, really not on their mind. It's something that it's difficult to invest time with very, very busy schedules. It's very difficult to dedicate time to that mission, particularly because you don't have very immediate outcomes for it. So Nicole mentioned the Ted Bundy case and how, you know, of course, the rationale. We all know the rationale that it is better when the agencies work together and share information. We have to figure out good strategies, how to overcome some of those political boundaries, budget boundaries, and so on and so forth. Kennedy I think you talked about fusion centers and information sharing. Yes, certainly. That's a huge step forward in Homeland Security landscape, although, fusion centers are very massive questions about their effectiveness. Versus the expenditures and time commitments that those different agencies have to dedicate to them. And I know a lot of police agencies that withdrew their representation from fusion centers because they just couldn't allocate the money for the information they were getting back, particularly because a lot of times when this information comes back, you can't share it within your agency because nobody has a clearance. Even you, if you got a clearance to be in a fusion center, which you might have gotten it, then you go back and you can't share with your chief. So then the agencies are thinking, are we really getting the return on investment by dedicating this one officer who could be in the community, who could be doing our investigations and stuff like that in our department? They're dedicated to this fusion center. What they're bringing us is not a whole lot. So we might as well pull out. So fusion centers, they're great. They have been very controversial in research, and they need to be evaluated and assessed more, certainly. So if you had to do the revolution for DHS, I think all of you expressed that you were very surprised how low the level of satisfaction is and well-being of employees at the Department of Homeland Security. So now we are zooming in at the department, and so those different agencies. And you talked about the fact that people feel like they are disposable, not appreciated at the very low level, no formalized leadership frameworks, and the climate. I think that Nicole talked about toxicity or at work. When you talk about organizational cultures, very different sort of depiction on how the organization works. It could be a jungle where there's a lot of competition. It could be a house of horrors. And I think that's what Nicole is describing, that, there might be some real nice managers or, some nice people working there, but it's a very toxic environment overall because of other stuff going on. And so certainly you all have known when you go into a place and you can tell whether it has a positive climate or negative climate. Let's take, for instance, school. Kayla likes schools. So let's take a school. You go into a school and you know which school is sick. In a sick school, you don't have beautiful artwork of kids on the walls. You've got, kids walking around the hallways, not during a recess time. It's very hard to find the assistant principal. Everything is gloom. The teachers are stressed out. They don't engage, parents don't engage, don't come, don't do extracurricular work. There's not a lot of after school activities, and so on and so forth. You can tell that type of school when you walk in. And also when you walk in, you can tell a school that's vibrant, that, you look at the walls and you know that kids are supported. You know that they have a mission. You know that they promote this and this and that. You know that they have a visitor center that is, welcoming you, yet, they're asking security questions and stuff like that. You know that the teachers are alert and present, and assistant principals are walking the hallways and checking nobody is, loitering and stuff like that. That climate of the organization is part of the organizational culture, and it reflects leadership. It does. So, at Taco Bell, if you have a toxic environment, then you don't have good leadership. And so you might think you have nice managers, but you don't have good leadership. And it was really interesting I think, Nicole, you were asking yourself the question, they're not paying me enough for that. It's really sad in chains, but specifically in federal government. When you think about it, in federal government, there are classifications of employees, right? There are certain levels. Let's say they GS10 or whatever they are, and so you get paid a certain salary based on the level of work that you are doing, and everybody else gets the same. And so the competition, if you come up with something brilliant, with a proposal or whatever, there's not even anybody to give it to, because you are in that bureaucracy. And so, and if you do give it to somebody, it ends up much higher on somebody else's desk, and some other people take credit for it. So there's not a whole lot of motivation for people making the same amount of money, being in the same classification, and not being paid attention to, and not being recognized, and not getting the kudos to do a tremendous work. So so that's very troublesome about the Department of Homeland Security, because people, and I think you have a really great presentation on that by Aaron, that theory X and theory Y. And the theory Y says people come to work and they want to do their best. So you need to, as a leader, bring out the best in people, unless you of course think theory X. People just come to work to cut corners, be assigned in place, do minimal required, get the paycheck, and disappear. And so it depends where you sit on that continuum, how you lead. And certainly it looks like the Taco Bell a situation looks like a theory X, and perhaps DHS is not far away from it. And think about, I just want you to think about, let's say, ICE, part of DHS, and think about what those folks are going through as far as what the media is saying about their jobs. And so imagine if you were part of ICE and you are underpaid, you just lived through the shutdown, and you are underpaid, you're not recognized, you're underappreciated, you feel disposable, and how that affects your overall performance. So reflect on this. If your bosses and your leadership does not build value in you and doesn't support you, and then you've got the external world, it's very, very difficult position to be in. So the leaders have to be, in a way, also protective from those external factors, which are at play now in different jobs that are related to security and protective services. So you moved on to talk about resilience, and I think that there is a general consensus that there's quite a lot of overlap, that emotional intelligence and resilience are sister concepts, because you have a lot of self-control and self-regulation. I think Kennedy talked about it quite a bit. Definitely within the five domains identified of emotional intelligence, and then you have this repeated in the resilience features of successful organizations. Presence d'esprit. You're wondering how it's a French word. It means the spirit. So esprit de corps means like a spirit of the workplace. So if you have a really, really good flow with other people, it's just a good optimal feel. A little bit related to climate, optimism, positive outlook, certainly. And I'll tell you something about that. We get students, and students can be generally divided into, as far as communications, okay, students can be divided into a few categories. So the first category, of course, I call them the optimists. So the first category of students, they always write back when they get feedback, or they always thank you for the class, or they always thank you for a good semester, or they always, thank for whatever. They're always thankful, upbeat, and positive. And if you do a project, they're always excited to do it, and they always raise their hand. So those are your optimists. Then there are the students that are concerned. So be concerned, you only hear from when they have a problem. They don't know where to post, they don't know how to answer a question, or they are not agreeing with a grade that they are given, or they have some issues and they cannot attend class, or they have some other issues with performance. And so you hear from those students when they're concerned. And then, of course, you've got the invisibles. The invisibles are students you never hear from unless, they're submitting something. And that's usually one-liner, here is my assignment. And that's rarely, hello, how are you? And rarely closes with a salutation. And I have to tell you that between those three groups of optimists, concerned, and invisibles, certainly we see how those people do in the workplace. The optimists are always the first ones to get a job, always, no exceptions. The people that are invisible, usually we really don't know much about them because they remain invisible. So we don't see them very much in professional networks. Every now and then they pop out and they might be successful or not. But they are not in the mainstream generally. And then the concerned are usually the ones that continue to have concerns after they've graduated. They can't locate a job. They're having trouble in a position that they are getting. If we hear from them, certainly a lot of times it's just to remedy something. So certainly, and I'm saying this, and this is really big. I haven't done research on that. It's just my years of observation. And the reason I'm talking about it is because that optimism is really, truly contagious. And when you have that self-affirmation and positive outlook, which is huge part of general mood and emotional intelligence, that leads to success and links to performance. So I think that emotions are contagious, and certainly, we did not consider that in Taylorism era, but they are. Self-regulation, self-control, motivation, and tenacity. Those were some of the other ones that I think Kayla linked. And you talked about lifelong learning, enhanced learning, and leadership. And I think Kennedy was talking about the development and life learning opportunities. And you were somewhere in that discussion, you were talking about how supportive and nurturing your workplace is, how they are interested in your contributions, how they are trying to find out where they can support you in your development and how to push you forward to maximize your potential. And that was a counterexample to what we found out in that well-being report about the Department of Homeland Security. So I thought that was really nice that, of course, you are in the private part of that private-public partnership for Homeland Security, right? So it's very interesting that, there are a lot of really good business models in the corporate sector for employee progression and promotion and support and lifelong learning, which I think I agree with you is very, very important. The other question that you discussed, and I think Kayla went as far as getting some more information on that, was translational readership and complex adaptive leadership. And I think that you identified that generally the main difference was administrative, because as far as translational leadership, you described it as the liaising or somebody that is the middleman or facilitative ability to work across different environments. I call it dispersed leadership. So, it doesn't necessarily have to come from the top. This is something that those linking pins that happen at the middle level. A lot of that model on translational leadership exists in some organizations like universities, for example, because universities tend to decentralize towards the middle. So it's the middle levels that sort of are more in control than like presidents and provosts. They don't really do a whole lot, and they don't tell people what to do, and even vice presidents don't do that. It's generally down to the deans and directors. So it gets down to the middle management, and from there it's easier to disperse it than from the very, very top. It's easier to have those liaising functions. professions and provide this translation across different colleges and departments and so on and so forth. So I think that one of the other issues that you mentioned is that the translational stuff was a little bit more leadership, whereas the complex adaptive leadership had a much bigger administrative dimension. And I think I would agree with you, because it has to do beyond the leadership. There's also that piece of management. So it's not just the adaptation enabling, but also that very big administrative piece. You had you had huskies in your presentation, or a husky. That is really sweet. Hearing the rubber toy throughout your presentation. Congratulations, Erin. You talked about kudos, and you talked about recognition and stuff like that. And certainly, when we get to the section on generational divides, I think this is going to be really huge, because I don't think mine or a previous generation grew up with a really strong need for recognition, not as much so as your generation. And I think that when we look at the professional development of people my age, and when we look at our wheel of life, or when we self-assess, it's generally what's generally lacking from our wheel of life or something is recognition, because we don't demand it, and we don't clamor for it. And people in those professions that are in protective services professions, they recognize that they do what they do because it's their job, because that's their mission, because that's what they signed up for. But times have certainly changed, and expectations have changed, and we know very much about human behavior and our emotions, and that we need to be recognized, right? And we become burned out, and we become PTSD'd, and we become all those different toxic things that can happen to the employee when they are not recognized. So recognition really important. People should feel like they're needed. I think, Kayla, you said something about how you work at school, but even though people seem generally supportive, like they like you and send you cookies when they have leftovers from the meetings, it's not necessarily a very deep recognition. It's not personalized. It's not targeted to your particular contribution. And so that deeper appreciation, a lot of times, it's kind of like when asking somebody, how are you? And they say fine, when in reality, they buried 2 pets and, can't pay the mortgage and stuff like this. Is that superficial recognition, like good job, versus actually recognizing that you have talent, that you've contributed, that you are important. Kennedy talked about approachability and the ability of employees to be able to approach, and Kennedy had some really good insights about recognition in his company. I think that Kayla mentioned that figure 3.3, the lines in DHS being and I quote, hot mess, when you talked about the organizational culture. And I loved this observation. I loved that you brought it out, Kayla, because you have to, when we are looking at this sick DHS employee satisfaction being so low, and the well-being of and that links to being able to foster your emotional intelligence and social skills and interacting with others. All that is affected, right, by the inability to be recognized. So what Kayla brought about is a very important point about organizational culture. This is a department that was created out of a chunk of 22 different agencies that all brought different values, different, you call it ethos, with them, and some of them were built from the scratch. Like TSA did not exist prior to 9/11, right? So it's a brand new organization. And then there were some very good ethos, and like Coast Guard, and Coast Guard remains to be one of the best led agencies within DHS. If you look at Coast Guard and took it away from DHS, they probably do very well separately in their employee recognition, stuff like that, because they maintained very much their organizational culture. They truly only got put into DHS as a box, but they didn't have to get, mixed up with a lot of different factors. Like, FEMA had to, unfortunately, when it got put in under DHS and lost the status of a, presidential level agency, access agency. So this is very difficult. And think about this. Take FBI. FBI was created in 1908 as an agency, and as such exists to today. The mission changed a little bit, but you've got 110 years of developing your organizational culture. That is huge. Versus DHS, some of those agencies that are brand new, like TSA, and they're trying to establish their identity within 18 years in a time where things change very rapidly. When FBI was growing up, and being a young kid on the block, they really didn't have a whole lot of competition. They didn't really have to play with anybody else for a long, long time, and they were able to establish their identity and their culture. And so it's very difficult, to manage this. I think Kennedy talked about mergers and benefits and disadvantages of mergers. Those different agencies bring their good points, the bad points, and the ugly, and their culture with them. Things they've always done, things they always do differently than other agency. That's their source of pride and distinction and how they're better. I always heard for years that FBI agents saying, well, DEA are the agents that couldn't make it to FBI. Because there was this superiority or feeling of superiority that FBI was better than DEA, because all DEA did is, kick in the doors and did drugs, whereas, FBI was this, hugely intellectual and intelligent agency, and it wasn't just about busting. Busting was just at the end of it. So they called DEA a paramilitary structure, whereas FBI was more of an intellectual structure. I mean, in reality, there are a lot of DEA guys that would never ever want to be FBI agents, and there are some FBI agents that would love to be DEA agents in reality. Right? But organizationally, that myth was perpetuated. So when you got into the FBI, it was just more prestigious. It was better. It was all that. And, when you get into DA, they probably were saying, we actually get things done. We don't need 50 people on one arrest warrant, the case that you work for 10 months and stuff like that. So those agencies get merged. There are a lot of issues that come in, and organizational culture is certainly one that needs to be managed very slowly and over time. And that's, that is going to remain a big challenge for Department of Homeland Security. So I really like bringing that in because in order to have an identity in the organization, that identity has to grow and be nurtured. If you don't have growth, if it's very young and then it hasn't been nurtured, then you've got all those bad ingredients. All right. So yes, so Kennedy had some really interesting points on mergers, and you got into money. Certainly money is in everything. So I just mentioned to you there's different funding strands that prevent cooperation, that actually produce competition. The way some grants are written, unfortunately, they're so designed that there's not that communication or collaboration that you would want. Lessons learned from European NASA. I think that Kayla was talking about the fact that some of the lessons from NASA could be adopted, of course, not wholesale. I think that was a very good observation. Now, remember also that that was a practice that they implemented in the 60s. And then, they did have issues at NASA with groupthink and with a shadow that disintegrated. So certainly the agency didn't maintain the same type of leadership at all times. And so you might ask yourself, and a lot of times it's personality driven, or somebody, the big leader that can breathe the life into the organization. So perhaps DHS hasn't had yet a secretary that was visionary enough. And lo and behold, they've had many. So I enjoyed your presentation and your overview of the topics. I hope you enjoyed it. I know that you've read the readings. You had a lot of really good examples from them, from Crystal, as well as others. So with that, I'm looking forward to your third one.